morning, everyone, and welcome to Anna Lee's Dissertation Defense. Anna is a PhD candidate defending her PhD in Health Promotion Sciences. The title of her dissertation is A Multinational Study of the Etiology and Clinical Teleology of Moral Evaluations of Patient Behaviors. Her committee members are Dr. Ellen Stacy, who is the chair, Dr. Kim Reynolds, and Dr. Ben Shea. My name is Joanna, and I'll be the moderator for today. Just a basic overview of the order of the virtual exam. Anna will start her presentation, followed by questions from her committee. After Dr. Stacy concludes her presentation, we will stop the recording. At that time, Anna and the audience will be sent to a breakout room while the committee members deliberate. When the committee is finished deliberating, everyone will be brought back to reconvene, and the audience may ask questions then. And then the closing remarks for the committee. Just as a reminder, please keep your microphone off during the exam. If you turn your microphone on, a member of our team will turn it off for you. The chat will remain closed during the exam except for messages to the moderator. If you have questions for the speaker, please message them to the moderator and we will address them at the end of the exam. Please be aware that this exam is being recorded. And I'm turning it over to you, Dr. Stacy.
Okay, I also want to welcome everyone here, including our guests from outside. Welcome to CGU Dissertation Defense, and we're happy you're here. Anna's done a lot of hard work on this, and I think all of you, know that. So Joanna gave a really nice overview of how we're going to do this. I've asked Anna to talk about her dissertation research for up to about 45 minutes to give you an idea of the timeline. And then again, we will go into breakout. The committee will go into a breakout room, and then we'll get back to you maybe 5 to 10 minutes after that, we hope, and we'll continue after that. So at this point, I especially want to welcome Anna, who again has done a really nice job, and thank you for all your hard work. And without further ado, please go ahead, Anna.
Thanks, Alan. I really appreciate you all joining today, and thank you so much, Alan, for your support in being my advisor. Thank you to my committee for all of your hard work and all of your patience with me. I want to thank everybody who's here in this meeting, in particular my uncle David, he's always encouraged me to get a PhD, and also my friend Karis. She's right now, it's 2 a.m. for her in Beijing, and so she logged on. She's also been along with me for the ride, trying to encourage me to get my PhD. So really glad that you guys can join me. So I want to introduce just the topic of this dissertation. It's called A Multinational Study of the Etiology and Clinical Teleology of Moral Evaluations of Patient Behaviors. And so in it, I introduce a tool for measuring moral evaluations of patient behaviors as a psychological construct hypothesized to be of relevance to clinical care, and analyze some of the hypothesized entities' causes. So that's why I use the word etiology, in order to analyze the pragmatic functioning of the entity in clinical settings. So that's why I use the word teleology. I became interested in this line of research after wondering what happens when health professionals treat people's behaviors with regard to eating or drinking or having sex, or otherwise treating their personal health as morally relevant. So I wondered how this kind of mindset could affect how health professionals treat their patients, in addition to themselves. So to provide some background on what I mean here by moral relevance of patient behaviors, A lot of perspectives hold that behavioral disorders such as addiction, for example, are in no way moral, but they're rather factors of neurochemistry, biology, sociocultural context, or environment. And so these perspectives are presumed by some to be more humane, especially because punitive responses to stigmatized disorders can result in the dismissal, shaming, mistreatment, and neglect of patients, not to mention burnout and distress among clinicians. One study indicated that when clinicians are overly moralistic, their perceptions of their patients become distorted, and their relationships with colleagues are in places adversely affected. Other studies have shown that the extent to which clinicians make or don't make moral judgments of patients' behaviors can lead to distress and clinician burnout, interference with clinician teamwork, and erosion of trust between patients and practitioners. It also affects the equitability in healthcare, workplace professionalism, and damages patient-practitioner rapport, and also in some places blocks the advancement of empirical science. By contrast, other perspectives highlight that there's an inherent relevance of behavioral disorders to human morality and point to the success of 12-step interventions for addiction, which emphasize a need for addicted individuals to take moral inventories of their lives, and also note a need for more research on the effects of moral evaluations on a wide range of clinical factors and health outcomes. In my dissertation, I explore how a clinician's moral convictions affect proxy measures of the practitioner-patient relationship. I examine whether clinicians can believe in the existence of moral absolutes with regard to patient behaviors without having this belief be manifested in a shaming or harmful manner in which they treat their patients. After exploring much literature on this subject, it became clear to me that my questions were part of an enormous area of inquiry, which has long intrigued researchers from the fields of bioethics, medicine, psychology, philosophy, sociology, and theology. My research narrowed into how moral evaluations among health professionals are associated with readiness to humanistically interact with patients, as measured using survey data on compassion, self-efficacy, and optimism with regard to patient care. I'd now like to share some photos with you of my data collection adventures. The upper left picture, this is of me at an observership in the addictology service at St. Anne's Hospital in Paris. The top middle photo is of a lab meeting in the functional neurosurgery department at Region Hospital in downtown Shanghai, where addiction is treated using functional neurosurgery or deep brain stimulation. I visited several treatment centers, sometimes just to look at the interiors of the buildings and the public activity, in order to gather information on how patients, specifically ones with substance use disorders, are treated. One topic of major controversy regarding China's treatment of drug use disorders is their compulsory rehabilitation camps, which also serve as forced labor camps, where treatment and prevention programs are limited. The top right photo is of a rock painted by a patient in a drug rehabilitation center in China. It has the image of a snake that is ensnaring a man's body, and it apparently represents this man's enslavement to addiction or past enslavement. That's apparently what he was trying to portray. And in my interpretation and some colleagues who were looking at the rock who he painted it. The bottom left photo is of an instructional poster on the development of clinical psychology. This was displayed on one of the floors of the Shanghai Drug Abuse Treatment Center. I attended conferences, roundtable discussions, and private meetings to discuss and develop the hypotheses in this research. The bottom middle photo was taken at the 2019 Compassionate Mind Foundation in Edinburgh, where I learned a lot about clinical factors associated with compassion, a construct which later I included in both studies 3 and studies 4 of my dissertation. I learned a lot about the construct of compassion from conference attendees, and also by presenting my research at that conference and receiving great feedback on it. That's the picture on the bottom right of the screen. That was the poster I presented. The hypotheses and the interpretations of the 4 studies in this dissertation are based on prior literature, my own observations, and discussions with colleagues from multidisciplinary fields. In order to minimize regional biases and maximize cross-cultural applicability, I spoke with hundreds of health professionals in North America, Western Europe, and the People's Republic of China. This is a picture of me in the apartment of Dr. Iris Barowi. She was a professor that I met while attending the Alcohol and Drug History Society's biennial conference in Shanghai last year. I'm so glad there wasn't COVID last year. She generously allowed me to stay at her home during the month that I collected data in Shanghai. That was December of last year. Karis and Steve, who were both on this call, they both came to visit, and that was wonderful. Once I created the survey measure and had it translated into French and Chinese by professional translators and obtained IRB approval for moving forward, I began recruiting participants. This involved collecting contact information from professional health organizations, along with postgraduate schools of medicine, nursing, and psychology. Requests for study participation were made using standard wording via email, social media, and telephone. Response rates were approximately 10% across all 3 countries. In Shanghai, recruitment included intercepts in a mixture of 5 public and private hospitals. Recruitment scripts included information on the purpose and estimated duration of the study. As an incentive for participation, participants were provided with the option of entry into a raffle for $100, €90, or 700 renminbi in California, urban France, and urban China, respectively. The final samples consisted of 173 health professionals in California, 102 health professionals in urban France, and 249 health professionals in urban China. These are the photos of the intercept approach that I used for collecting data in hospitals in urban China, in which I would walk up to people and offer them the card that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, where it has a barcode where it has that item you can scan on your phone in order to fill out the survey on your telephone. In most of the hospitals that I visited, I was accompanied by a hospital representative who sometimes helped with translation. After analysis of the data, I created 4 separate studies. The first one introduces the theoretical construct of moral evaluation of patient behavior as a psychological entity which refers to moral judgments of patients' health-related behaviors and introduces a survey measure intended to assess these moral framings specifically as they pertain to substance use disorders. Study 2 explores the hypothesis that authoritarianism and religiosity are both predictors of moral evaluations of patient behavior. Study 3 explores whether moral evaluations are predictive of readiness to interact humanistically with patients with stigmatized behavioral disorders using 2 measures of moral evaluations as predictor variables. The first was moral evaluations of patient behavior specific to substance use disorders, and then the second was moral evaluations of the self, like the self being the health professional themselves. Study 4 also explores whether moral evaluations are predictive of humanitarian care for patients with stigmatized behavioral disorders using only the measure of moral evaluations that was developed in Study 1, not the measure of moral evaluations of the self. What Study 4 adds to Study 3 is that Study 4 was conducted on health professionals in all 3 countries, whereas Study 3 was only conducted on California health professionals. So as an introduction to why I felt that there was a need for any of this research, I believe that the moment that health professionals look at their patients and decide that their patients' problems have anything to do with morality, they're faced with a series of choices in 2 categories. The first includes giving up, feeling that the patient's problems are beyond clinical help, developing a sense of impatience with or disliking for their patients, or feeling discouraged or demoralized in their role as a clinician. The second category is fundamentally different. It includes an activation of a sense of moral duty to support the patient, the triggering of a consideration of psychological, sociocultural, or environmental factors of which the patient may be experiencing, and an increased likelihood to suggest treatment approaches which might support the patient's inner life. Study 1 developed and psychometrically evaluated a survey tool for the hypothesized construct of moral evaluation of patient behaviors, which refer to the tendency to view patient behaviors within a moral framework, so as carrying moral meaning or being situated on a spectrum from moral to amoral or immoral. The reason for the development of this tool was so that future research would be able to be conducted to understand mechanisms by which health professionals behave toward patients with behavioral disorders. The study examined moral evaluations of patient behaviors in the category of substance use disorders, since this is a category that often comes under moral scrutiny. The measure that was developed in this study includes 6 items, scored 1 to 4, with higher scores indicating stronger moral evaluations of substance use or users. The survey questions were adapted from the non-moralism subscale of the Substance Abuse Attitude Survey. In order to determine the functioning of moral evaluations of patient behavior across countries, measurement and variance was first evaluated by comparing increasingly restricted models and retaining the most parsimonious model that demonstrated adequate model fit. Measurement and variance was only established at the configural level, in which the same pattern of fixed and free factor loadings were specified for each group. This least restricted model included no equality constraints across groups. There are many reasons that this measure may have operated differently by country, and this finding does not come as a surprise, since a wide body of research indicates differences in concepts about morality by culture. Some possible reasons for the differences by culture which were found in these studies include there's differences in substance use and drug laws by country. There's also differences in concepts of the very nature of human morality itself by region. And also a big thing is religiosity. America is disproportionately religious when compared with both France and China. To illustrate, in a 2013 global attitude survey that was conducted in 39 countries, 53% of participants in the United States said that they felt it was necessary to believe in God to be moral, while in France, this percentage ranked lowest among all surveyed nations at 15%. That was a Pew Research Center survey. In China, the landscape of religiosity is less dominated by monotheistic religions. The most highly represented religious groups are Chinese folk religion and Buddhism, which together comprise approximately 47% of the population according to the World Religion Database. While the Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist, it does recognize 3 monotheistic religions, Catholicism, Islam, and Christianity, which comprise very roughly 9.2% of their population, according to the World Religion Database. It's really hard to get accurate data on religiosity in China because of a really large number of unregistered house churches and illicit religious groups where it's just really hard to track them. While configural invariance would certainly imply that group differences merit some discussion, the weak invariance that was found in study 1 indicates that we need to exercise caution in interpreting the group differences, and they need to be considered preliminary. In order to evaluate whether the latent construct of moral evaluations of patient behavior satisfied the assumption of unidimensionality, 3 single group confirmatory factor analyses were run in M+7. Factor loadings indicated that at least 25% of the variance of each item was explained by its hypothesized factor of moral evaluations of patient behavior. Results from the CFAs, the confirmatory factor analyses, indicated that all Cronbach alphas of survey items were above 0.832, and that demonstrates the internal consistency of the survey measure and also provides evidence for the unidimensionality of the construct that it measures across countries. So in sum, study 1 introduced a measure for assessing moral evaluations of patient behavior, examined its psychometric qualities, and it indicated that moral evaluations of patient behavior appears to, the measure appears to measure a single latent trait that's partially invariant across countries, and also provides cross-cultural information about demographic characteristics associated with moral evaluations of patient behavior. Analyses of variance and t-tests suggest that moral evaluations of patient behavior is significantly higher among younger health professionals. And so this could indicate that as people age, any views that they might have had about substance misuse being immoral become less extreme over time. This change in perspective may be a result of what people witness or personally experience regarding drug use over the course of the first 45 years or more of their life. And the difference can also represent a generational difference in perspective. It's also possible that participants in the over 45 age group belong to generational cohorts in which drug use was more common or more accepted. Moral evaluations were also found to be highest among nurses, followed by physicians and then other health professionals. This finding can be interpreted in light of studies which indicate that nurses are less permissive towards substance abuse than social workers, and also recommend more punitive responses to problem drinking in comparison with physicians, psychologists, and other workers who advocate for more therapeutic responses. Studies have shown that nurses are more likely to recommend compulsory treatment for problem alcohol use when compared to physicians, and that nurses are less tolerant and more morally condemning of alcohol and drug use when compared with other health professionals. I thought that this was a very compelling picture in terms of the moral evaluations component. So the results showed, oh, and this was taken in the Shanghai Drug Treatment Center, which is part of the Shanghai Mental Health Center, which is run by the Chinese government. So results showed that moral evaluations are higher among Chinese health professionals when compared with French and American health professionals. And these findings may be studied through an exploration of the values that shape each country's moral landscape. So given collectivist social tendencies in China, the construct of moral evaluations of patient behavior in the Chinese context might be shaped by thoughts about how substance misuse impacts the social lives and the communities of patients who are affected by substance misuse. So concepts of moral evaluations in China, even though they might not be as affected by religiosity per se, they might relate to cultural factors like the notion of losing face. In Chinese, it's 丢脸, which is a really big deal in Chinese culture. It's the moral, emotional state of losing respect among one's peers and social circle. And so since the effects of mental illness on the reputational status of a patient's family and social network is pretty considerable, it's possible that the high levels of moral evaluations of patient behavior reported in China reflects a greater consideration of the effects of substance misuse on family members and social groups, as opposed to the effects of substance misuse on just the patients themselves. I spent a lot of time trying to understand what shapes people's views of morality in France and in China. I observed people in their daily lives, and I also had really engaging conversations with students and professors I met in the university I stayed at, as well as the hospitals that I visited. So here's a peek at just some of the hospitals I visited in Shanghai. Every time I got the opportunity, I would ask people about their ethical worldviews. I would ask people about what they thought was wrong and what they thought was right, and to what degree, if at all, they felt their morals might be shaped by their religious or other beliefs. When I asked one nurse in China that question, she laughed, and I remember she said, "Religion? Do you mean communism?" And even though she was kind of teasing me in her response, she told me that communism truly was what shapes her views of morality. And then she gave me a copy of the Constitution of the Communist Party of China, and that's what's pictured on the top left-hand photo of this slide. Another conversation which stood out to me was with a college-aged boy in Shanghai. I asked him, "What do you think it is to be a good person?" And he thought about it for a really long time. And then he said, "To not cause trouble." And so these responses are just some of which are part of what inspired me to examine authoritarianism in addition to religiosity as predictors of moral evaluations of patient behaviors in study 2. This picture is of the Luxembourg Gardens, a very popular park in the 14th arrondissement of Paris. I walked through this park almost every day during my observership at St. Anne's Hospital. I spent every day approaching people on benches, on the grass, at their picnic blankets, and asking them if they would be willing to talk with me about their views on substance use and morality. The gardens are less than 1.5 miles away from several hospitals and healthcare facilities, one of which is pictured above. So that's Hospital Cochin. So many of the people that I ended up speaking to were also health professionals. The conversations that I had there were also very helpful in creating my studies and making sense of the results. In study 2, I examined 2 hypothesized drivers of moral evaluation specific to substance use disorders, religiosity and authoritarianism. These 2 predictors were selected because public policy is in many places shaped by concepts either related to religion or regarding the rights and responsibilities of the government over personal choices. As stated by political scientist James Morone, Moral judgments shape the definition of rights, the distribution of prestige, and the dispensation of social welfare benefits. As such, this study explores religiosity and authoritarianism as drivers of moral evaluations of patient behavior. Religiosity can affect a person's sense of ethics both directly and indirectly. In many religions and religious denominations, substance misuse is viewed as immoral, if not explicitly, then for its associations with other behaviors which are viewed as immoral, such as hedonism or immoderation. In some religions or religious denominations, there exists the belief that substance misuse causes harm or impurity, not only to the physical body, but also to the immaterial soul, the human spirit, and also the sacred relationship between a person and the divine. Now, authoritarianism can be broadly defined as a philosophical approach which embraces obedience to authority figures and figureheads, including in-group norms and traditions. As such, inherent to this construct are moral evaluations and expectations. It's assumed that the relationship between authoritarian attitudes and moralistic expectations is bidirectional, with authority figures shaping people's beliefs about morality, and such beliefs about morality shaping people's views of authority figures. Social conformity has been examined both as a dimension and as a positive correlate of authoritarianism. This is relevant to the current study given that construction of social conformity has been shown to be associated with feelings of intolerance toward deviant or amoral behaviors or immoral behaviors. The study hypothesized that religion and authoritarianism would be positively associated both with one another as well as with moral evaluations of patient behavior, despite variations both within and across religions and types of authoritarianism. This study used structural equation modeling in M+7, employing maximum likelihood estimations with robust standard errors to evaluate the effects of authoritarianism and religiosity on moral evaluations of patient behaviors, controlling for age, gender, and occupation. Moral evaluations of patient behavior were measured using the 6-item Likert scale, which was developed and psychometrically assessed in study 1. Authoritarianism was assessed using 6 items selected from the authoritarian attitude subscale of the Child-Related Values Survey, a measure which assesses 6 factors that affect people's views of children. Religiosity was assessed using the Duke University Religion Index, a Likert-style measure, which was developed for the study of religion in terms of its effect on health. The primary finding from this study is that religiosity and authoritarianism were both positively associated with moral evaluations of patient behavior, with a small effect between authoritarianism and moral evaluations and a medium to large effect between religiosity and moral evaluations. The positive effect of religiosity on moral evaluations of patient behavior was expected, given that all major world religions ascribe moral meaning to the human body, and human behaviors and beliefs about deities or deity, singular, are often, if not always, related to beliefs about a moral order. The findings in the study don't indicate that religiosity is positively associated with generalized moral behavior. Actually, multiple studies indicate the opposite. Rather, the suggestions of the President study are limited to the effects of religiosity on personal ideas about what constitutes moral or immoral behavior. The positive, albeit less pronounced effect of authoritarianism on moral evaluations of patient behavior was also expected, given that concepts of morality are shaped and validated by relationships with authority. For some, respect for authority is actually a form of morality. So in sum, this study indicates that both religiosity and authoritarianism are predictors of moral evaluations of patient behavior. This finding may inform future research on mechanisms by which moral evaluations of patient behavior affect health and clinical outcomes. Study 3 explored whether 2 types of moral evaluations by health professionals, those of the self versus those of the other, are associated with factors of readiness to humanistically interact with patients with substance use disorders. Moral evaluations of patient behavior were again measured using the survey tool, which was introduced and psychometrically evaluated in study 1 and also used in study 2. Moral evaluations of the self were assessed using Jordan and colleagues' 9-item moral self-image scale, which was created based on the work of the psychological construct of moral identity by Aquino and Reed. This measure contains questions which ask asked participants how they view themselves in terms of various aspects of morality compared to where they would like to be or where their ideal self would be. And the items used on this scale were compassion, fairness, friendliness, generosity, helpfulness, hard work, ethic, honesty, and kindness. The construct of moral evaluations of the self is related to that of personal moral identity, which refers to placement along a continuum of morality from immoral to very moral. Yes. So as a non-clinician, I used every opportunity I could get to speak with clinicians to look for what outcome variables I could examine for how to measure specific impacts of moral evaluations on clinical care. So these are technical skills, such as the punctuality, number of patients seen per hour. There are the technical skills, such as these harder skills like number of patients seen per hour, medical knowledge. But I wanted to look at the softer humanistic factors of clinical competence because I believe that those would provide better inferential value as proxy measures of how health professionals treat their patients. Humanistic factors of clinical competence have been identified in the medical and nursing sciences as non-technical skills, and they include various cognitive, social, and emotive capabilities that allow for holistic patient care. They have traditionally been less emphasized when compared with technical skills such as work habits and medical knowledge, but in the past 3 decades, the importance of these types of skills has increasingly been emphasized in medical and nursing literature. There exists no consensus in the fields of medicine, nursing, or psychology regarding a comprehensive list of what are humanistic factors of clinical competence, but factors that have been explored in research include emotional intelligence, compassion, interpersonal or communication skills, and the capacity for self-reflection. Because a wide body of research exists on compassion, I selected this as an outcome variable for studies 3 and 4. Compassion is a factor that many medical schools and hospitals train and assess students and employees on, regardless of whether health practitioners agree with or approve of patients' lifestyles and behaviors. And as for self-efficacy and optimism, I'll give you a background story of something that inspired me to look at this in my research. During the hospital observations that I had in France, I was watching a senior physician work with the same patient for an entire week, and there were multiple setbacks and indications of non-compliance on the part of the patient. And it seemed to me that every effort on the part of the clinician was being utterly sabotaged by the patient. Near the end of the week, shortly after yet another failed attempt to provide the patient the support he needed, I asked the clinician, "How are you feeling?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up and just said, "Confiant." He explained that, which means confident. He explained that even though there had appeared to be no progress with the patient, in actuality, the efforts of the past few days had helped to pave the patient's learning on where to find resources and how to access them, so that when he had the time to learn this information again in the future, it would be easier the next time. This was just one of the many incidents which caused me to look into self-efficacy and optimism as additional factors of readiness to interact humanistically with patients, which I examined as potential outcomes of moral evaluations. Self-efficacy carries major implications for health professionals' ability to interact humanistically with their patients. According to Bandura, self-efficacy has been identified as a determinant of people's choices of which goals to pursue, as well as their decisions regarding how much time and effort are spent in pursuit of these goals. As such, self-efficacy may enhance clinicians' abilities to engage with patients in otherwise challenging situations. Research indicates that self-efficacy for addressing alcohol-related problems has been positively associated with higher screening and referral behaviors for such problems, and that self-efficacy for one's counseling abilities has been positively associated with a higher likelihood of counseling one's clients on smoking, as well as with more time spent on counseling sessions. The third construct, optimism, can be considered a form of prognostic expectation or feeling about the probabilistic outcome of clinical treatment, and also the degree to which people view patient care in an optimistic light. It is presumed that this construct acts as a buffer against caregiver burnout, enabling caregivers to find meaning in or to discover alternative solutions to their challenges. Research indicates support for optimism in clinical settings. For example, one study found that positive outcome expectancies, which can be considered as a form of optimism, were predictive of responsiveness to female victims of abuse. While positive prognostic expectations have been associated with improved clinical care, negative ones have been associated with demoralization in one's work or clinical burnout. Fun fact, from what I learned in the French hospital, the word burnout is the same both in English and in French. In study 3, Structural equation analysis was run in M+7 using maximum likelihood estimation with robust standard errors to evaluate the predictive effects of moral evaluations of patients' behavior and moral evaluations of the self on 3 factors of readiness to interact humanistically with patients while controlling for age, gender, and occupation. Questions on the compassion toward patients with substance use disorders survey measures were developed based on questions used in Shioda and colleagues' compassion subscale of the dispositional positive emotion scale, which measures dispositional tendencies to feel compassion toward others. Items in the self-efficacy in assessing and responding to substance use disorders measure were adapted from wording used in a measure for self-efficacy in assessing and responding to female victims of abuse, as well as from items used in the evidence-based practice confidence scale, which assesses confidence in engaging in activities that are part of the process of implementing evidence-based practice. Items in the measure of optimism toward treating patients with substance use disorders were adapted from wording used in Chappelle and colleagues' treatment optimism subscale of the Substance Abuse Attitude Survey, which assesses optimism regarding the outcome of various medical treatments. Findings indicated good model fit for the measurement model, and reliability indices demonstrated internal consistency of items, which provide support for the assumption of unidimensionality for each latent construct. Examination of control variables indicated higher levels of self-efficacy among men when compared with women. Results showed small but significant associations between moral self-identity and both compassion and self-efficacy toward treating patients with substance use disorders. This finding matches the assumption that health professionals with higher self-evaluations would show greater readiness to interact humanistically with patients with substance use disorders. According to Bandura, self-efficacy influences thoughts, actions, and emotional arousal and accounts for differences in coping behaviors and abilities to respond to career stressors and failures. As such, if somebody has a higher moral self, they might be less bogged down or stressed by self-doubt. Moral self-image can be viewed here as a form of self-confidence, would presumably be associated with lower levels of stress, greater perseverance and flexibility, increased ability, which would naturally be associated with higher self-efficacy. DiClemente and colleagues showed that self-efficacy is useful for predicting behavioral change related to smoking, alcohol disorders, and eating disorders. To illustrate, a clinician who believes that I am the kind of person who treats patients well would be more likely to think, I can treat patients well because I must. So moral self-image should enable clinicians to stay centered and be more open to their patients because their moral code tells them to engage wholly with their patients, irrespective of the difficulty thereof. As for the relationship between moral self-image and compassion, according to one theory, compassion is part of a socio-motivational system that involves the regulation of self-identity. It's a state which optimizes one's ability to act in ways that are consistent with one's best possible self. So accordingly, the belief that one is living in a manner that's consistent with one's best possible self or moral self-image may be part of a feedback loop, both with compassion as well as with other self-perceived factors of morality. According to moral identity theory, individuals see themselves as situated along a continuum of morality, and they act in ways which aim to verify their self-placement upon that continuum through an ongoing self-regulating process that is driven by a desire for self-consistency. And when self-evaluations of behaviors align with concepts of personal moral identity, identity verification or validation ensues. And when they don't align, negative moods such as self-blame and shame ensue. So this pertains to the finding of the present study in that if a health professional has a higher moral self-image and views compassion or self-efficacy as being more moral of characteristics, then his or her desire for self-consistency may explain the positive associations between moral self-image and those characteristics. This interpretation is consistent with the notion that the desire for self-consistency motivates thoughts and actions in the direction of personal moral identities. These findings can be interpreted within the context of research which shows that caring for the self and caring for others draw from a similar set of skills and competencies. It also draws from research which indicates that caring involves nurturance and motivation to support both the self and others. And research which shows that among volunteers for HIV services, self-focused motivations such as personal development were more predictive of volunteers' duration of service when compared with other focused motivations such as community concern. Results showed a large positive association between moral evaluations of patient behavior and optimism, and a small to medium negative association between moral evaluations of patient behavior and self-efficacy. The negative association is novel and suggests that some forms of moral evaluations distract from or pose as barriers to humanistic patient-centered care. It's possible that the negative association between moral evaluations of patient behavior and self-efficacy in the California sample relates to health providers' perceptions of their personal roles and responsibilities and their abilities therein. So for instance, health professionals in the US who have a higher moral evaluation of patients' behaviors may also experience greater feelings of moral duty toward their patients. And in these cases, the health practitioners might feel a greater burden of responsibility to alleviate or cure their patients. And then the prospect of, or the actuality of their inability to do it may explain a decreased sense of self-efficacy. It's possible that the limitations in the social environment and the healthcare system for treating patients with substance use disorders in California or the United States as a whole underlie the negative association between health professionals' moral evaluations and their perceived self-efficacy for treating patients with substance use disorders. This goes to reason given that in the past 10 years, America's drug overdose mortality has been the highest among its peer countries. Religiosity may also be relevant to the low level of measurement and variance, as well as to distinctions between predictive effects and moral evaluations of patient behavior on self-efficacy and optimism in the United States. So for example, if a person is religious and believes in the supremacy or power of a higher power as it relates to patient behaviors, then that health professional might feel that the power of healing is not necessarily within his or her own control. This might thereby cause that person to feel also less self-effective in treating the patient, but also simultaneously more optimistic, since he or she might believe in the capacity of the higher power to inspire hope and healing that transcends the limits of human capabilities. So this suggestion is consistent with a large body of shame literature, which indicates that moral judgment is associated with distorted views of patients' vulnerabilities and behavioral decisions, and that moral disgust toward patients often leads to feelings of hopelessness or inefficacy on the part of health providers. The study has a place in the growing body of literature on the importance of self-care and self-compassion, particularly among health providers and first responders. The current study collectively suggests that among health professionals, attunement to personal moral strengths can enable greater readiness to interact humanistically with patients, and conversely suggests that attunement to the moral valence of patient behaviors can stimulate mixed effects. The human tendency to consider issues such as morality according to predetermined mental frameworks is normal, but may be manifested differently and to different ends. The present study suggests that some versions of moral evaluations contribute to life in terms of their positive associations with factors of readiness to interact humanistically with patients, while some contribute to death in the form of negative associations with that same humanistic interaction. In study 4, I explored one of the same questions that was introduced in study 3, that is the effects of moral evaluations of patient behaviors on factors of readiness to interact humanistically with patients. The only difference is that I used all 3 countries as opposed to just California. Again, I conducted a measurement and variance analysis and only found weak configural variance. It may have been affected not just by differential concepts of morality by country, but also by differential understandings of the meanings and importance of various factors of humanistic care by country. So one country might say it's more important, for example, to have compassion, or more important to be optimistic or self-effective than the other. So to account for the differences in the operation of the constructs of the focus across countries, 3 initial single group structural equations models were run, one for each country. As was the case in study 3, moral evaluations of patient behaviors was the exogenous predictor variable, and compassion, self-efficacy, and optimism were the endogenous outcome variables. Results showed that moral evaluations of patient behavior was positively associated with optimism across all countries, as well as with compassion and self-efficacy in urban China. The only contrasting effect with all the positive associations was the medium-sized effect found in the negative association between moral evaluations and self-efficacy, and that was discussed in study 3. I speculated that health professionals in the United States who have a higher moral evaluation of patient behaviors may also experience greater feelings of moral duty toward their patients, and that in these cases, the practitioners might feel a greater burden of responsibility to alleviate or cure their patients, and the prospect of or actuality of the inability to do that may explain the decreased sense of self-efficacy. And I speculate that the reason that this effect isn't seen in France and reversed in China may relate to the resources that these 2 countries have for treating substance use disorders. I can talk about that a little bit further if you like in the questions, but I'm coming up quick on the time, so I'm going to shorten this a little bit. Basically, in sum, the current study provides support for a balanced perspective on the concept of addiction as a matter of moral relevance. And although morally based responses to substance use disorders have been shown in some places to be tragically and ineffectually destructive, the study suggests that the subject of morality as it relates to substance use disorders is not categorically or universally problematic. It supports the position that addiction may be discussed at least partially as a disorder of choice, and that effective treatments for it may be informed by recognition and discussion of addiction as a matter of ethical, philosophical, and/or spiritual implications, both for the afflicted individuals and for society at large. Future research is needed in order to understand distinctions between what one author referred to as legitimate versus illegitimate moral appraisals in healthcare settings. To investigate this question, future research may explore distinctions between types of moral appraisals in order to determine which types contribute to rather than impair clinical care. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, okay, yes, we want to start with questions from the committee members. So feel free to ask anything you want about her work or her talk.
Okay, Alan and Anna, I have a group of questions just as I went through the dissertation and considered the larger issues. So, Alan, you want me to just throw out a couple of questions or just run through my whole list? How do you want to structure it?
Well, usually we would go through the whole list. So,
Okay.
but I don't know how. I don't know if you're talking about 5 or 6 or 10 items or 50. So if it's 50 items, we should probably hold off on some of those.
Oh, I could probably keep it to about 4 or 5. If that works.
Oh, that's fine. But you should mention anything that you think is very important.
Okay. Sure. Well, my questions are all a little bit broader, more global, and those were the issues that really occurred to me as I read through it and wanted to get Anna's points of view on them. And there are a few that are a little bit more specific. And before I start, I'd just say it's really interesting and well done, and tremendous amount of effort too, collecting data in 3 countries. That's impressive. So thank you for sharing that work with us. The first question just had to do with study 1, and there's the measurement and variance issue, and it shows that the instrument seems to operate separately by country. So I was just curious then, first question is, do you think you need separate instruments by country or even by region or even within something like moral philosophy? Is that the implication here, that you need to be constructing and validating different instruments? And then sort of the big question then, and gets at your research and where you want to go from here with this work is, what do you think are follow-up studies that are necessary with this instrument?
So I want to thank you for your question. And as for the question of weakened measurement and variance, yes, I do believe that this measure operated differently among different countries. And multiple studies have found that constructs or conceptions of morality are different by country. The Moral Values Survey, which is a popular survey in terms of human morality, it showed that there's very weak measurement and variance across 27 different countries. I think it's still okay. There is research that supports looking at group differences despite weak measurement and variance, just tempering these understandings with the result that the measurement operates differently by country. In terms of follow-up behaviors, I think that one thing that you bring up is that it's important to have follow-up studies, because in order to understand why it operated differently among countries, that would be pretty informative. So one would be, in study 2, we looked at authoritarianism and religiosity. And so I believe that since both of these were found to be associated with human morals and the way that human morality is constructed, we can kind of look at these and the diversity in terms of religiosity and the diversity in terms of authoritarianism as possible drivers of how the effects between moral evaluations and humanistic interactions operate. So, for example, in terms of religiosity, there's different forms of religiosity that could have been measured. There's intrinsic religiosity versus extrinsic religiosity. In terms of authoritarianism, there's authoritarianism with regard to raising children, authoritarianism with regard to social values, authoritarianism with regard to the government. So a follow-up study could look at, for example, whether the positive interactions between moral evaluations and humanistic interactions operated among people who reported high on measures of intrinsic religiosity, for example, but say did not operate in the same way, perhaps operated negatively among people who scored high on extrinsic religiosity. So looking at that, and then also looking at a more specific look at particular forms of substance use, because the category of substance use disorders was fairly wide, and so different forms of substance use are villainized very differently by country. So where substance is illegalized, for example, then it's considered generally to be more immoral to be engaging in use in this behavior. So for example, cannabis use is illegal in both France and in China. So it's viewed as more immoral to be using it in China and in France, because not only are you using a substance using a drug, but you're also breaking the law. Whereas in California, it's not viewed in the same way. But then smoking, the effects are reversed. So you see smoking, it's highly prevalent in China, and it's much more prevalent in France than in the United States. Just taking a more specific look at specific behaviors, and then also looking at moral evaluations of patient behaviors as they relate to other stigmatized behaviors like dietary habits, risky sexual behaviors, other behavioral disorders. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. And you were actually starting to address some other questions I had too, so I may be able to check some of those off of my list. I wanted to ask you about study 2. As I was reading the introduction to the study, the background, it looked like you focused in very quickly on authoritarianism and religiosity. And I was just curious if you had thought about or done a lit review to explore other potential predictors of moral evaluation of patient behavior. And, a question also related to that is, are there omitted predictors, do you think? Are there determinants that you didn't measure in addition to authoritarianism and religiosity that may have explained some variation in moral evaluation?
Yes, there were many other factors that I had considered when looking at moral evaluations. I had looked at I had considered levels of education. I tried to see what was looked at in the literature. And one of the things that has been looked at a lot is Altmaier has what's called the authoritarianism. It's a measure of authoritarianism, and so there's different scales, and so these scales measure perspectives on right-wing authoritarianism, perspectives on sexuality, perspectives on women's roles. So perspectives on gender. I considered ethnicity. Yes, I considered many other factors. These were the ones that I felt were most relevant to my hypotheses. So that's why I decided to include those.
I'm just curious, as I was thinking about, well, what might some omitted predictors be? Did you have anything, or did you consider something like prior experience with substance users, but maybe these people are all treating substance users, so that's irrelevant. It's, you know, something they all have experience with, or things like social network effects. What do their reference social networks think? How do they view drug use, and do they consider it moral or immoral? So
Yeah,
curious.
that's a very much something I was also interested in, is the time that's spent with people who have substance use disorders, health professionals who specialize in substance use, in treating substance use, versus who don't specialize, number of years of experience. So I looked at a number of those factors in the survey on the California health professionals. I didn't look at them in the France and the China surveys, just for the sake of time. But that is something that I was interested in, because the research does show differences in terms of subspecialties of health professionals, as was also indicated in study 1, which showed that nurses have the highest levels of moral evaluations, also that younger health professionals, also the Chinese health professionals. So if I could have looked a little bit more at whether or not these demographic factors were associated with any of the results that we're seeing, it might have been informative.
Okay. All righty, thank you. Just continuing here with my list, I think you've touched on this a bit. I was struck at, you know, how much religions can vary in the extent to which they view behavior and different kinds of behavior as being moral or not moral. And so it struck me that religiosity seems, in some respects, just a single measure of religiosity seems like kind of a blunt instrument to get at all the nuances that exist across different religious organizations. So I'm just curious how you'd start to get at those subtleties, that even within major religious traditions, they may view different behaviors very differently, and the extent to which they consider them moral, immoral, you know, harmful to society and to people within society. I mean, how have you considered how you would get at that in a more detailed way? And you've partially addressed that in your prior responses, but you know, it just seems like an important issue here, because you get effects for religiosity, and it's probably worth unpacking that, and just curious how you'd go about doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially because in different religions and religious denominations, you know, some are absolutely dry cultures, and so it's very different from religious groups where you know, alcohol, for example, or you know, mushrooms are even part of the religious rites or part of the celebration, social celebrations. So there is wide variability, and I considered that, you know, there's a bunch of subscales of religiosity. As I mentioned, there's the intrinsic religiosity subscale, extrinsic religiosity subscale. There's also social religiosity, so like what you do socially. But those don't pick up on the variability in terms of substance use per se. So I consider creating a single item that just asked about it, or a number of items. And so that would require creating a new measure in which people were asked whether or not their theological text, for example, included wording that banned or forbade against substance misuse, or any substance use at all. So, a scale could be made in which it's, all the way from never use to only use on celebratory occasions to if there's no problem with use at all. And so then religiosity would not be such a blunt instrument in that case.
And I wondered too, if you could just explore interactions with religiosity across subgroups within faith tradition. You might even be able to do something a little bit more straightforward like that, and start to see, the effects of religiosity being dependent on sub-traditions within a religious group, which could be pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I have one or two others. You can give me just a second. Well, let me just ask you a very general sort of traditional dissertation question. And then I want to come back to one more global question. So I just have two more. One is, of course, when you do a big series of studies like this, you always think about what you can improve on. So what would you do differently in terms of your study, your methodology, if you were going to, replicate some of this work?
Okay, shall I answer that now?
Yeah, how are there one or two key things that you did that you would do differently? Something in terms of measurement or design. How would you improve the questions and the methodology for the next round if you were going to do additional work in this area? Or, and said another way, if you were going to redo these studies and you could change one or two things, what would you do differently?
Yeah, thanks for that question. One of the things was the cross-sectional design. So that prevents me really from making any sort of causal interpretation. So I can talk about all the associations, but what I was really trying to determine was whether or not there was effect of moral evaluations on these factors of readiness to interact with patients humanistically. So if I could have used an experimental design given the resources, then that would have been excellent in terms of being able to allow for causal interpretation. Another thing is that I used a convenience sample. I would have been a lot more, I would have been more tight in terms of my, or specific in terms of my recruitment, because what I did is I looked up contact information from professional health organizations. I asked for recommendations from health professionals who I knew. So it was a fairly wide net. It went out to urban China or urban France, California. So it was specific in terms of the region, but in terms of recruitment strategy, if I could have determined a more specific form of recruitment strategy, that might have helped a little bit in terms of the generalizability. Another thing is the convenience sample that I used. If I could have gotten a random sample, then that would have also helped. Another thing is that I only used a single form of measurement. The self-report surveys. And so that's probably going to be subject to some bias. So if there was any way to collect data from another, like an other report measure, that would have also been great. And the term other health professional, it's a very wide category. So if I could have had a way to in the California sample, I allowed for a question. It was an open-ended response. And so then I was able to code a kind of a breakdown in terms of who was depicted within that other health professional category. If I could have also included that question in the China and the France versions of the survey, then that would have also helped me get a better picture as to who was comprised within that other health professional category. That being said, I believe that the generalizability is pretty similar because the treatment of substance use disorders, people get treatment from all sorts of health professionals. And a lot of times getting treatment any form of treatment at all provides a boon to the patient. It's not necessarily just a physician or a nurse or a licensed counselor, but sometimes it is somebody who, can be a yoga instructor. I didn't have any yoga instructors in my sample that I know of, but just getting any help for people with addictive disorders can be relevant to whether or not they recover. So whereas I would have liked more specificity in the other health professional category, I think it would have helped just a little bit. And then also, since I use structural equation models, it would have definitely been better to have larger sample sizes. I believe that the sample sizes that I had were sufficient for my study. They were supported by the use of these sample sizes in prior literature. However, it is the case that type 1 errors are inflated when you have sample sizes that are under 250, according to Hu and Bentler and Schreiber. And so that's something that I would have added. And if the sky was the limit, then I would have also included exploration of other behaviors in addition to substance use disorders, like dietary habits, risky sexual behaviors, and other behavioral disorders. I would have loved to include that in my data or in my surveys as well.
Okay, well, thank you for the thorough answer. Just a quick follow-up question. So on the causal effects and causal interpretation, you mentioned doing experiments. Do you think these are variables that lend themselves to manipulation, or are you better off looking at cause and effect using longitudinal designs here? So thinking about something like moral evaluation, is that something you really want to manipulate?
I would prefer a longitudinal design.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. And one last question, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. And this is my most general question. I was struck by what you said in the first study, and I think it was that China is changing in terms of some of these issues like autonomy, consumerism, materialism. And you could talk just briefly a little bit more about that. And I'm wondering how that impacts over time now, like over 5 or 10 year period, how that might change the dynamics here. Would you start to see, fewer differences between China and the West? So that's one way to look at it. The really big question is, as we globalize around the world, we're cross-communicating or cross-collaborating, at least till COVID hit more. And so do you think that's going to change the dynamics of these effects across countries over time? So will we start to grow toward a point where we have one sense of moral evaluation of patient behavior, for example, regardless of what country you're in, or will those perceptions tend to narrow over time across country?
Well, China has changed a lot, and it continues to change. And I believe that one interesting thing that you can see with regard to how they're changing is at least previously in the last 10 years, their responsiveness to criticism from the international community in terms of their responses to patients with substance use disorders. So there has been a lot of criticism from human rights watch groups and also the World Health Organization, which put out literature on how non-humanitarian their response to their drug use crises were. And so they have a large number of these compulsory re-education camps. And so they've put out a lot of public information about how they're trying to improve the status of or improve the conditions within these camps so that people have more rights and more access to medical treatment and psychological treatment, and their needs are provided for. I don't know that things will ever fundamentally change or come. I don't know that there will be too much of a merger between the similarity of the effects between how things are in, generally speaking, the areas of the West versus the East, because of how fundamentally differently the thought processes are of Chinese people and people who I've met in the United States and other areas of Western Europe. I mean, I remember talking to, first of all, the moral evaluations, the scores of them are almost double among the Chinese sample. And so it's not necessarily manifest. So the very idea of what is humanitarian in China, it's different from what's humanitarian here. So like if you look at, okay, I'll give you, excuse me. I was talking to a physician there and I said, so what happens if you can't kick a habit, like if you really can't kick it? He said, oh, you do get another try. You get one try. And then I said, then what? And so then he said, then you go to a camp. They take you to a camp. And so I said, like, do you think that I said, who do you think is most compassionate? Like France, the Americans, or Chinese in terms of how they treat substance use? He said Chinese. And so I thought, we just talked about compulsory re-education. How can that be compassionate? And then I talked to a patient there who is a former heroin addict. And so he was about to treat the patient. And he had come out of a camp that he had been in for 2 years. And he had had this compulsory re-education, forced labor. And I asked him about his experience and he was generally positive about it. He said, you know, it helped me kick my habit. It helped me turn my life around. And, you know, he said, I needed it. I kind of needed this strong treatment. And so it was I mean, that's just anecdotally, that's just one patient who I spoke with. But, you know, also I remember looking at photographs of this execution, the night before the execution of these drug dealers in China. And the night before the execution, all of the jailers and the women who were going to be executed the next day, they were hanging out in the same room. They were leaning on one another, even though their hands were handcuffed. They were brought special food like dumplings, and they were laughing together. And they were, you know, it was definitely a very warm, sort of compassionate environment. So there's this idea of punitive care or punitive responses, and it's coupled with this notion of compassion. And it's also encapsulated with this idea of the social society is at stake. So sometimes to be compassionate has to do with responding in a way that is compassionate, not just to the individual, but to society at large. And so this very notion, I feel like it's very aberrant to a lot of people who are in the West. There's a individualistic notion that's just very different. And so I think that the distinction between these concepts is very much a driver between some of these effects that are seen. And so I don't know that you're going to ever see a merging between these effects, because I think that this huge gap in thinking, in thought process, just underlies some of the mechanized effects behind what we're seeing here.
Right, and probably true in all cultures too, right? Like in the West, we're, you know, well ingrained in our way of thinking. So even though changes may occur with globalization, there are big differences that exist. That's what I hear you saying, and they may not merge in any substantive way. So thank you for all of your responses. That was my list, and I'll punt to others.
Thank you.
Okay, Ben,
Yeah.
go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you know, I acknowledge your, you know, the huge effort, you know, to develop this study and also conduct this study. You know, this is not very easy, you know, as a graduate student to do this, to collect this data, you know, in, you know, 3 countries. Yeah, basically, and you can think about this huge effort. Yeah. And I think, you know, I also supervise all your analysis. You know, you have, you know, done, you know, excellent analysis, you know, for this with this data. Yeah, and my, I read your, the dissertations, these dissertations basically, the 4 studies organized very well. And I do have some questions, and also some questions I realized, some are really overlap with Kim's. So Kim already asked these kind of questions. Yeah. For example, like, the study 1, and also, the whole topic is about more evaluation of patient, the behaviors, but more likely, your behaviors focus on substance use disorders. And, even though this construct, you supposedly, cover broad area. And also you mentioned, that for your future research, you may also consider, focus on other behaviors, including other behaviors. Yeah. So for these substance use behavior first disorders, especially like study 1, you include 6 items. And these 6 items instrument was administered to 3 different sites. And you also acknowledge the huge the differences across these 3 the sites, geographical differences, population differences, cultural differences, even the systems, clinical, health professionals. I mean, their training backgrounds, and these healthcare, even the healthcare, the system also different. But you can see these 6 items, in terms of the substance use. You have, I remember, you have at least 3 or 4, touch on the alcohol use kind of somehow. And you also, in your response to Kim's questions, also mentioned that, you also realize the legislative issue about the different, the substance, like for example, cannabis in use. For alcohol, for example, like from China, because I'm Chinese, I know the Chinese culture, alcohol, some kind of have a different, the image about alcohol use. So, in terms of the substance use disorder here, are you here referring to the involved, because in your, the items, phrase in the instrument, seems to be just a preview mentioned about alcohol, but in not talking about, this is the alcohol related, is, really indulge in the alcohol, abuse kind of. So my question here is, when you, selecting the instrument, especially when you, try to administrate a similar or same instrument in different, settings with dramatic distinctive background, all these kind of things, how you how guide you selected this instrument, how you prepare, how you have you done this kind of this review on this, how these instruments, how you any other alternative. This is also questions related to another, basically this question I also ask, I want to ask if you have the another opportunity, other kind of alternative measures you can think about. Yeah. So this also basically, related to this kind of methodological issue. And how do you, respond to this?
Thank you, Ben. So the survey items that I used, they were adapted from wording from the 1985 treatment optimism subscale of the substance, or sorry, I'm sorry. They were adapted from the non-moralism subscale of the 1985 Substance Abuse Attitude Survey from Chappelle. And that measure has in the literature demonstrated reliability and validity. I changed some of I didn't find any other survey measures that exist that measure exactly what I was trying to tap into, which is moral views as they applied to substance use. So this is one that has been established in the literature, but the reason I changed it a little bit is because some of it some of the terminology was a little bit outdated, and it was also religiously or denominationally specific. So it referred to, like, for example, clergymen, when in Islam you don't have that. So that accounted for the differences. And then in terms of using the terms alcohol, yeah, I know that that is specific, and it's true. There were 6 items that were used, and so 4 out of 6 of those items, they included alcohol or other drugs, and then the other 2 just more generally referred to as substance use. Well, the one thing that I did that made it a little bit more specific in terms of focusing in on substance use disorders as opposed to just recreational is I included the wording before that measure. It says, in answering these questions, please consider substances and drugs that lead people to seek psychiatric, psychological, or other medical treatment. So that wording indicates that there's problematic use. And so it's not, that was supposed to cue participants to consider substance use not as something that was just recreational, but something that was necessarily problematic. So there is a different view. And people recognize that, for example, cigarettes are a substance, but there is a lot of research on physicians in China, because a large percentage of male physicians in China, they smoke. So a lot of them don't believe that smoking is harmful to your health. At least that's what I read certain studies saying. So the idea is that when people are cued to think about substances, this measure was intended to focus in on them thinking about substances that are necessarily harmful. And yes, there was a lot of, there's going to be inevitably a lot of variability by substance and by country. So if I could tap into the variability a little bit more, I would just divide it up by substance. So cigarettes, e-cigarettes, alcohol, harder drugs like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, vaping. And so I would just have different categories, cannabis. And so that would be able to provide a more nuanced look.
Yeah. So yes, I think, when this is also kind of the limitation, when you, selecting this instrument, and also when you're talking about substance use disorders, more evaluation of these behaviors, maybe also consider, these the differentiation about this gateway drug and also this, hard drug or different kind of, and also consider the cultural, population differences in terms of the viewing of this, and also the legislative issues differences. Yeah. Another thing I'm talking about, is about, the recruitment, the samplings issues. I know, this is, recruit from convenient samples, but, your target, but your target population is still the health professionals. And also, this topic is for the, is focused on the moral evaluation of our patient behavior, primarily is in substance use disorders. So when you, focus on this topic, and you do the, sample recruitment. So when you do these, recruit these health professionals, so what kind of, I know you listed some criteria, but, I think, based on your experience so far, for what kind of a criteria you think is more important when you, recruit this? Because somehow, this may highly related to the response to the questions, and also some related to, the validity about your finding, kind of, yeah. How you consider, this recruitment, because so far is convenient, and also it mixed, different kind of, these health professionals from, kind of, mixed training backgrounds, because, for this topic, you think, because different also, they live in different countries, they receive, the training background also different. So years of training backgrounds and areas of training, and also, the areas of, even the specific, the ever experience dealing with this kind of patients also related to your, related to the response. And I think, how do you, if you get, how do you consider this recruitment criteria, how you guide you, to recruit, the sample, if you get another opportunity, kind of.
Okay, thank you. So if I got another opportunity and I had the time and resources to allow, then I would do what I would have liked to do originally, which is to look for health professionals who specifically have experience in working with patients with substance use disorders. Because some of the health professionals, the reason that I ended up including all health professionals is because I believe that the environment of health professionals is it is critical to, like, it's all part of a dynamic sort of environment. So say you have a hospital and you have a hospital administrator, and the hospital administrator never comes into direct care with the patient. They're never talking one-on-one. Maybe if they're judgmental or overly moralistic in a way that's negative toward patients with substance use disorders or dismissive of them, the patient, if the patient never sees them, maybe the patient will never directly be affected by feeling judged or feeling discriminated or feeling like a victim of stigma, but there will be a trickle-down effect because the way that they make decisions will affect these patients. Maybe they'll make policy decisions that are going to provide less services to patients with substance use disorders, or even the way that they act around their colleagues. It's very contagious. When you talk about a certain group of patients in a negative way, it can affect your colleagues who are having direct care with those patients. So if I could do it again, what I would love to do is I would look at specifically health professionals who only had direct one-on-one interactions with the patients, because I feel like that's the population that I'm most interested in terms of who's directly impacting the patients with regard to their demeanor, their comportment, their emotional intelligence, availability, engagement in the moment, in the clinical interaction. That being said, I'm glad I did it how I did it, because it is relevant for health professionals as overall. But if I wanted a more specific sort of interpretation of the results, then I would have liked to have had a specific sample of health professionals who have experience, whether current or prior, of working with patients with substance use disorders, because I think that is a little bit more specific to my particular research questions.
I think, these, and also, you also mentioned that, based on these findings, you find, especially like, the study 4, right? You found the kind of, construct effects, from this. So you also explained that, some, the difference finding you observed. And also, is this also, supported somehow, with, the differentiality about the measurements, differentiality about it, the differences about, these populations. So, I also want to mention that, in your, survey, they also, the social desirability issues may also, is a potential risk. Well, basically, this is also cannot, completely, eliminate in some other, similar surveys. But, how you think about, this might influence, your future, how you can think about, you can, how to, improve, your, research in the future,
Yeah. So in terms of explaining the differences by country, I think that, yeah, the availability of resources, as I was mentioning, probably really affected the different effects of the different associations between constructs. Specifically, we had that association between that negative association between moral evaluations of patient behavior and self-efficacy in California, and that wasn't replicated in France or in China, and actually was reversed in China. And I think that possibly, I really believe that it does have to do with cultural differences, but then also, it also could have to do with the availability of resources. So if the United States is doing so poorly right now with battling certain drug use disorders like the opioid crisis, which it's known for being very high in terms of mortality rate for overdoses. What resources France and China might have for responding to this situation might actually play into the self-efficacy of health professionals in those countries. So for example, in France, you have harm reduction, a lot of harm reduction services, including needle and syringe programs, opioid agonist therapy programs, both in and out of prison. They also have these safe drug consumption rooms. So they're called salle des chutes there. So it's where you can go have a cup of coffee. It's a clean place where it's supervised and people take drugs there. And so it's basically to get drug addicts off the street, provide a hygienic environment in which they're able to consume illicit drugs recreationally, intravenously in a safe way. Now, China also has harm reduction programs such as needle and syringe programs, opioid agonist therapy programs, but then they also have the ability to incarcerate people who don't, who aren't successfully treated. So it's kind of like, I believe that the feelings of self-efficacy would be, even if you can't do it as a health professional, even if you can't help your patient toward recovery in the way that you would like in France or in China, I believe that there's other resources that can kind of kick into play. And actually having a system of incarceration, that's also considered a resource for some, because it's like, well, if we can't solve it, it's out of our hands, but there's not necessarily a decreased feeling of self-efficacy because there's a system in play to respond to it. And then in terms of, social desirability bias, I think that that has to do with that's definitely going to be affected by how much people feel that they're supposed to be compassionate or supposed to be optimistic in clinical settings by country, which differs a lot, because, for example, there's research that shows that a lot of the medical ethics courses that are required in Western medical education are not required in a lot of Chinese medical schools, whereas in Chinese, a lot of Chinese medical education includes required courses on, for example, like Mao Zedong thought, Marxism, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Just anecdotally, when I included this question before in my survey, and it said, it wasn't just like, how compassionate do you think that you are, but it was, it said, how important is the following skill to you in addiction treatment settings? How important is it? And so then I asked the same question for compassion. I asked the same question for self-efficacy. I asked the same question for optimism. And among comparing California and urban France, health professionals in California said it was much more important to be self-efficacious or to be compassionate. So they said it's very important to be compassionate. And then in France, they said it wasn't as important to be compassionate. But the interesting thing is that they were about the same in terms of self-reported compassion scores. So there was no significant difference between them. So it just made me think, just remember that in some areas, the health professionals are probably hammered with messages about it's important to be a compassionate clinician. It's important to be optimistic on behalf of your patients, but a further analysis would be needed in order to explore what countries really value certain factors of those humanistic factors and how they value them by country.
Okay. Yeah, I have no further questions. Yeah, thank you for your taking time, addressing my questions.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Ben and Kim, for that. And I just have two, I don't think they're very complicated ones, but we'll see. Do you have any recommendations based on your findings and your reading of the literature, do you have any recommendations for health providers about how they express their views of morality to patients, or whether they should express their views? And as you noted in your dissertation, morality has a lot of different, tones and nuances. So I just wonder if you have any recommendations to health providers about.
I'm so glad you asked this question. Yes, the first thing is that this people's sense of morality, it's ingrained. And so you can't attack or you can't question somebody's sense of morality without, I don't know any full-grown adult where if you were to come at them in terms of their sense of morality, same thing with politics, right? If you question your political leanings, the way your worldview is, people are typically not going to just see the other person's perspective. So if somebody has a moral vantage point that sees the world through these sort of like, for example, substance use is wrong, inherently wrong, and people are hurting themselves, and say I'm a physician, my patients are engaging in unhealthy substance use. I know that this alcoholic is coming to me and they're probably going to have a, much decreased life expectancy, and they're not adhering to any of my recommendations. So the thing is that there's a lot of literature out there that is just hammering health professionals with this constant message of don't stigmatize these disorders, don't discriminate against them, be kind to them. But what a lot of health professionals are facing is that their own lived experience is feeling like there is a form of immorality that they're dealing with, and it's leading to a lot of demoralization, sometimes even among their own careers. And so if you say don't discriminate, don't judge, then I feel that a lot of these messages are falling on deaf ears. So I would say the first thing is embrace your own background and your own sense of moral compass. Everybody's moral compass is okay. That's okay. This is not intended as an attack on anybody's individual sense of morality, this research, because there is a lot of research out there which says that moral expressions in any sort of healthcare settings are totally inappropriate. So for example, in France, there's this concept of laïcité, where you're not supposed to express any form of religious sign or anything in hospitals, in government areas, and in educational facilities, because it's supposed to be for more equality of expression. And so it's completely unwelcome if you were to say, based on my religious beliefs, I would say this as a physician. Well, the thing is that people have ingrained beliefs, but I think the focus should be then is on focusing on outcomes and considering that there are differences in terms of forms of expressions of moral values. So as I mentioned, there's two sort of categories of moral expressions, and I conceptualize them as one that's leading to life in terms of healthy outcomes, and one that's leading to death in terms of giving up, just judging, and feeling hatred towards self, hatred toward patient, and just a loss of hope in kind of one's work. So to consciously focus, almost like to meditatively consider, what is my concept in terms of, I do view things sometimes through a moral lens, and a lot of people do view the world through a moralized lens. So to one, encourage people that that is okay, that's normal, and it is nobody's position to question your own particular moral values, but also to consider the fact that there are nuances in terms of forms of morality, and to be able to consider the manifestations of one's own moral reactions internally and also externally with regard to how it affects the patient. So, you know, for example, I was having a conversation with a health professional who, you know, is close to me, and I said, well, you know, you're always discriminating against your patients. So this person said, well, you know, they're just hurting themselves. And I said, but what you're doing, how is that helping the patient? Like how? So it's just kind of this question of, is it contributing to life, or is it, because it's always focusing on, is this hurting you? Is this hurting the patient? What are the outcomes of your own particular moral manifestations and expressions? And so I think that would be an area that I would love to explore in future literature, is one, distinctions between definitionally neutral moral evaluations and definitionally negative discriminatory stigma. And that would be difficult to tease out, but it would be fascinating. And then just being able to, in terms, to put it in terms of some sort of easy to understand communication with health professionals in terms of expressing, hey, there are distinctions in terms of how you can internally experience and also externally express your moral evaluations in ways that are actually consistent with everything which you want. You want a fulfilling career, you want joy in your career, and you want health and life for your patients. So what type of moral evaluations are more in that area as opposed to the area that's kind of got you stuck in this problematic area that you yourself don't want to be in?
Okay. Okay, thank you. Now the next one, we should just take maybe 1 minute on this because we have to move on here. So it does sound like you may want to continue in this line of research. Is that right?
I'd love to.
Okay, and so if you were able to take your next step, could you just very briefly, because we really have to move on, could you tell us what that would be, just generally? You don't have to go into a detail, but what would be your very next step?
I would look to connect with other people who have done research in this area, and I would see if there's any possibility either for funding or for collaborations, because I feel very alone.
Okay, good. Great. Well, thank you very much. And now we're going to have to move on to breakout rooms because the committee has to discuss, and then we will get back in. I'm hoping that won't take very long, but anyway, so if everyone could hang in there a minute. Jolanda, can you set us up for that?
Yes, I'll stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.